You've probably walked past first class dozens of times. The wide seats, the champagne, the smiling flight attendants, the curtains separating two completely different worlds. Most people assume it's simple. One group paid more, the other didn't. End of story. But what if I told you that some of the most powerful parts of first class have almost nothing to do with the seat itself? Because airlines aren't just selling comfort, they're carefully designing an experience that begins long before anyone steps onto the airplane. Which raises an interesting question. If the goal were simply to make passengers more comfortable, why does the experience start at the airport? Think about it: priority check-in, priority security, private lounges, separate boarding lanes. By the time first-class passengers actually reach their seats, they've already spent an hour feeling different. That's not an accident, it's the first clue. And once you notice it, you start seeing things you probably walked past for years without ever questioning. Take the boarding process. Most people think boarding first is simply more convenient. And yes, it is. But there's something else happening. Every passenger walking toward economy has to pass the first-class cabin. They see the larger seats, the champagne glasses, the quieter atmosphere, the warm lighting, the space. For just a few seconds, everyone gets a glimpse of the experience they aren't having, which raises another question. If airlines only wanted to provide a premium product, why make sure everyone else sees it first? Because surprisingly, the seat is only part of what's being sold. The feeling begins long before takeoff. It begins the moment someone hears, "We'd now like to invite our first-class passengers to board." One announcement, one sentence, yet somehow it feels important, almost ceremonial. And ceremonies have always done one thing exceptionally well. They separate people, not physically, psychologically. Once you're listening for it, the entire airport starts feeling different. Separate entrances, separate lines, separate waiting rooms. Even the signs quietly remind you that some travelers are moving through a different experience, which leads to an even bigger question. If airlines invest so much effort into these invisible details, what are they really trying to sell? Because the answer has surprisingly little to do with flying, and almost everything to do with how human beings experience status. The answer begins with something surprisingly ordinary: a curtain. Most people assume it's there for privacy. It isn't. It barely blocks sound, it barely blocks light. On many airplanes, it doesn't even reach the floor, which raises an obvious question. If the curtain doesn't really separate the cabins, why is it there at all? Because its real job isn't physical, it's psychological. The moment that curtain closes, the airplane no longer feels like one cabin. It feels like two completely different worlds. And once you notice that, another detail suddenly stands out. Economy passengers almost always walk past first class. But first-class passengers almost never walk through economy. Think about that. One group is constantly shown what they're missing. The other rarely sees what they're leaving behind. That's a fascinating design choice, because comparison only works in one direction, which points to something interesting. If airlines wanted every passenger to simply enjoy their own flight, why build the experience this way? The answer starts long before boarding. Walk through almost any major airport. The entrance to the first-class lounge isn't hidden down a quiet hallway. It's usually surrounded by thousands of travelers, elegant glass doors, soft lighting, comfortable chairs, people quietly relaxing behind polished windows. Even if you never step inside, you know it's there. And that's exactly the point. Because luxury doesn't only exist to be experienced, sometimes it exists to be noticed. Which leads to another surprising observation. The people inside the lounge usually aren't looking out. The people outside are looking in. That completely changes the psychology. Because suddenly the lounge isn't just a waiting room, it becomes a symbol. And symbols quietly change the way we measure ourselves. 5 minutes ago, sitting at your gate felt perfectly normal. Then you walked past the lounge. Suddenly, the exact same seat somehow feels less satisfying. Nothing about your trip changed, only the comparison did. Which raises an even bigger question. If simply seeing luxury can change the way we feel, what exactly are airlines selling? Because the answer isn't just a bigger seat, and it isn't just better food. They're selling something much harder to measure. The feeling that, for a few hours, you've stepped into a different version of yourself. And that's where the invisible status trap finally begins. The strange part is, there's nothing wrong with first class. The seat is genuinely larger, the food is usually better, the service is often excellent. If those things matter to you, and you can comfortably afford them, there's absolutely nothing wrong with enjoying them. Because that's not the trap. The trap begins the moment the seat stops being about comfort and starts becoming evidence. Evidence that you've made it, evidence that you're successful, evidence that you're finally becoming the person you hoped you'd be. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Can a boarding pass actually prove any of those things? Surprisingly, no, because the person sitting in seat 2A might have paid full price, or they might have used airline miles collected over several years. They might have received a complimentary upgrade, their employer might have paid, a family member might have surprised them, or they might simply be flying on one unusually special occasion. From the outside, every one of those stories looks exactly the same. That's fascinating, because our brains quietly fill in the missing information. We don't just see a first-class passenger. We imagine a lifestyle, a bank account, a level of success, a version of reality that may not exist at all. Which creates another question. If appearances can be so misleading, why do they influence us so strongly? Because human beings have always looked for shortcuts. We naturally use visible signals to guess invisible things. A tailored suit, an expensive watch, a luxury handbag, a first-class boarding pass. Our brains turn those objects into stories. The problem is that objects rarely tell the whole story, which leads to one of the most expensive financial mistakes people quietly make. They begin spending money, trying to match someone else's visible lifestyle, without ever knowing the invisible financial decisions behind it. Imagine someone taking out a premium travel credit card, not because they travel often, but because they love the image of airport lounges. Imagine paying annual fees, chasing elite status, booking flights you normally wouldn't book, simply because it feels like progress. Nothing about that decision happens overnight. It happens slowly, one upgrade, one premium purchase, one justified expense at a time, and eventually, luxury stops feeling like an occasional experience. It starts feeling like the minimum standard. That's called lifestyle inflation. And it's remarkably difficult to notice while it's happening, because every new normal quickly stops feeling luxurious. Think about your first flight. Everything felt exciting, the airport, the window seat, watching the clouds. Now imagine someone who flies first class every month. Very quickly, the wider seat stops feeling extraordinary. It becomes expected. That's how human psychology works. We adapt, and once we adapt, we start searching for the next upgrade, the next lounge, the next cabin, the next exclusive experience. But there's one thing that doesn't add up. If every upgrade eventually becomes normal, where does the satisfaction actually come from? Because airlines can't sell permanent satisfaction. Nobody can. What they can sell is anticipation. The feeling that the next purchase, the next experience, the next status level will finally feel different. Sometimes it does, for a while. Then our expectations quietly catch up, and suddenly, we're searching again. That's why the invisible status trap is so powerful. It doesn't convince you to enjoy luxury. It quietly convinces you that luxury is where your satisfaction lives. Those are two completely different ideas. One creates memories, the other creates dependency. And that's where the financial lesson quietly appears. Real wealth isn't measured by the experiences other people can see. It's measured by the choices you can make, without needing anyone else to notice them. That's an entirely different definition of success, because true financial freedom gives you options. It lets you fly first class or economy, without either choice changing how you feel about yourself. There's something surprisingly peaceful about that. The next time you walk past the first-class cabin, look a little closer, not at the seats. At the story, your mind immediately starts writing. Ask yourself, how much of what I'm feeling comes from comfort, and how much comes from comparison? Because once you can tell the difference, the invisible status trap starts losing its power. And that's the irony. The people who are most financially secure often have the least to prove, not because they don't appreciate beautiful experiences, but because they no longer need those experiences to convince themselves they're successful. That's a freedom no boarding pass can ever provide.